The courtroom doors swung open with a slow, deliberate creak, as if even the hinges hesitated to welcome the man stepping through them. Elliot Remington. A name that carried weight, not the kind that inspires respect, but the kind that bends rules, buys silence, and crushes opposition. The billionaire real estate mogul strode in, flanked by a trio of high-powered attorneys in $1,000 suits. His presence sucked the oxygen out of the room. To him, this was just another game, another courtroom, another judge who would bow, another prosecutor who would fumble. He had won every time before. Judge Helena Whitmore watched from the bench, her sharp gray eyes tracking Remington's every movement. Unlike others, she wasn't intimidated. If anything, she looked unimpressed. The gallery murmured as Remington took his seat at the defense table, his smirk radiating the same smug confidence that had shielded him from consequences for decades. His fingers tapped idly against the polished mahogany, his eyes flickering with amusement. He had been charged with financial fraud, embezzlement, and tax evasion, but in his mind, none of it mattered. His lawyers had already crafted their defense, and his money had always been his best weapon. The prosecutor, Mark Holloway, adjusted his tie before rising. Your Honor, the people will prove beyond any doubt that Elliot Remington has defrauded investors, hidden assets offshore, and manipulated financial records to avoid accountability. He has systematically exploited legal loopholes for over a decade. Remington barely stifled a chuckle, leaning toward his attorney. He sounds dramatic, he whispered, loud enough for those nearby to hear. The arrogance dripped from every syllable. Judge Whitmore raised an eyebrow. Mr. Remington, I trust you find these proceedings entertaining? Remington looked up, offering a lazy smile. With all due respect, Your Honor, I find them unnecessary. The gallery gasped. His attorney visibly paled. Judge Whitmore let the silence stretch. Then, her voice, calm yet razor-sharp, cut through the room. I suppose we'll see if you still feel that way by the end of this trial. Remington grinned. He still thought he was untouchable. He didn't know the ground beneath him was already cracking. Elliot Remington reclined in his chair, watching the prosecutor shuffle his papers. His fingers tapped against his expensive Rolex, a subtle reminder that time was money, and he had plenty of both. He had walked into courtrooms like this before, always leaving unscathed. To him, the justice system was nothing more than a slow-moving inconvenience, something that could be handled with the right connections, the right amount of money, or a well-placed favor. But Judge Helena Whitmore wasn't like the others. Mr. Remington, she said, her voice crisp, I assume you're well aware of the allegations against you? He exhaled sharply, feigning boredom. Oh, I'm aware, Your Honor, but I must say I'm a little confused as to why we're all here. This is just a misunderstanding, after all. Mark Holloway, the prosecutor, took a step forward. A misunderstanding? Mr. Remington, do you deny transferring $200 million into offshore accounts under shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands? Remington chuckled. My financial team handles my assets. I trust they operate within legal boundaries. I wouldn't know the details. I'm a businessman, not an accountant. Holloway smirked. That's interesting, because according to these emails, he lifted a stack of papers. You personally authorized these transactions. You even sent specific instructions on how to disguise the withdrawals to avoid detection. The smirk on Remington's face faltered. Judge Whitmore leaned forward slightly. Would you care to explain that, Mr. Remington? Remington's lawyer, a tall man with a permanent scowl, stood up. Objection, Your Honor. These emails could have been written by anyone on his team. There's no definitive proof my client composed them himself. Judge Whitmore nodded slowly. Fair enough. She turned to Holloway. Prosecutor, do you have additional evidence linking Mr. Remington to these transactions? Holloway's smirk widened. As a matter of fact, I do. He walked toward the jury and pressed a button on a small remote. A large screen flickered to life. A video. Security footage from inside Remington's private office. On screen, Elliot Remington sat behind his grand oak desk, typing furiously on his laptop. The audio played, Send the money in smaller amounts. Keep it under $10,000 per transfer. We don't want it flagged. Make sure the records disappear." A chilling silence filled the room. Remington stiffened. His lawyer swallowed hard. Judge Whitmore turned back to him, her gaze unreadable. "Still confused about why we're here, Mr. Remington?" For the first time in his life, Elliot Remington had no words. Elliot Remington clenched his jaw, his polished confidence cracking ever so slightly. The courtroom, once an arena he thought he controlled, now felt suffocating. His lawyer leaned toward him, whispering, "Stay calm." "We can argue that this video was taken out of context." Remington straightened his shoulders, forcing a smirk. "Your Honor, with all due respect, a video of me talking about money transfers doesn't mean I committed a crime. I discuss finances every day. That's what billionaires do." Judge Whitmore's expression remained unreadable. "So you're saying the video is meaningless?" "Precisely," he replied, feigning nonchalance. "Unless the prosecution has actual proof of wrongdoing, I'd say this is all just theatrics." Mark Holloway, the prosecutor, didn't blink. "Your Honor, the defense is right. A video alone might not be enough." He paused, letting the words settle before delivering the blow. "But a bank executive's sworn testimony detailing how Mr. Remington personally directed fraudulent transfers? Now that's something else entirely." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Remington's fingers twitched. His lawyer visibly stiffened. Judge Whitmore turned to Holloway. "Are you saying you have a key witness?" Holloway nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. A former senior executive at Remington Holdings has agreed to testify. Under oath, he will confirm that Mr. Remington not only knew about these illegal transfers, but orchestrated them to avoid paying taxes and defraud investors." Remington's smile vanished. His head snapped toward his attorney. "Who talked?" he hissed under his breath. His lawyer was already flipping through documents, searching for names. Holloway answered the unspoken question. "Perhaps you remember a Mr. David Whitaker?" Remington's grip on the table tightened. David Whitaker, his former financial advisor. The man who had been with his company for over a decade. The man he thought would never turn on him. Judge Whitmore leaned back, studying Remington. "Mr. Remington, do you have a response?" Silence. For the first time since the trial began, Elliot Remington wasn't smirking. He was sweating. The courtroom felt like it had shrunk. The air was thick with anticipation, the weight of 1,000 unspoken words pressing down on Elliot Remington. For years, he had walked through life untouchable, slipping through legal loopholes, buying his way out of trouble. But now he was the one cornered. Judge Helena Whitmore flipped through a document in front of her, her face unreadable. Then, she looked up, her gaze piercing. "Mr. Remington," she said calmly, "would you like to take this opportunity to explain yourself before I make my ruling?" Remington hesitated. His usual bravado faltered, but only for a moment. Then, with a deep breath, he straightened his posture, forcing confidence back into his voice. "Your Honor," he said smoothly, "this entire case is built on circumstantial evidence and the word of a single disgruntled former employee. I am a businessman. I move money. I make deals. That's not illegal." Holloway smirked. "You move money, Mr. Remington? Because according to these records," he held up another document, "you moved other people's money, siphoning millions from investor funds into your own accounts. Would you call that just another business deal?" Remington's lawyer shot up. "Objection, Your Honor. This is pure speculation." Judge Whitmore raised a hand, silencing the room. Then she spoke, her voice slow, deliberate. "Mr. Remington, let me be absolutely clear," she said. "The evidence presented today is not circumstantial. The prosecution has provided documented proof of your financial crimes, backed by a direct witness willing to testify. Your attempts to manipulate this court have been noted." Remington swallowed. The room was utterly silent as the judge continued. "In light of the overwhelming evidence, I am issuing a full asset freeze on all accounts associated with you and your businesses, effective immediately." The words struck like a gavel to the skull. Remington shot up from his seat. "You can't do that." Judge Whitmore barely blinked. "I can, and I just did." The billionaire's world was collapsing before his eyes. Elliot Remington stood frozen, his face drained of color. For the first time in his life, he wasn't in control. The gallery erupted in whispers. Reporters frantically scribbled notes. Even his own lawyers exchanged uneasy glances. They hadn't expected this. He leaned forward, gripping the table. "Your Honor, this is absurd. You can't just freeze my assets without due process." Judge Whitmore remained unfazed. "Oh, but I can." She gestured to the court clerk. "The Department of Justice has already issued an emergency injunction. Your accounts are now under federal review. All transactions have been suspended, pending further investigation." The billionaire's jaw tightened. "I have businesses, employees. This will cripple my entire empire." The judge nodded. "Yes, it will." Her voice was steady, devoid of sympathy. "That's what happens when you engage in criminal activity, Mr. Remington." The weight of her words sank into him like lead. The realization was setting in. He couldn't buy his way out of this one. Across the room, Prosecutor Mark Holloway took a step forward. "Your Honor, the prosecution also requests that Mr. Remington be held without bail. Given his wealth and access to international resources, he presents an extreme flight risk." Remington's head snapped toward his lawyer, his eyes wild. "Do something." His lead attorney, clearly shaken, stood and cleared his throat. "Your Honor, my client has cooperated fully. He has no reason to flee." Judge Whitmore lifted an eyebrow. "No reason to flee? Mr. Remington has over 25 offshore accounts, 4 private jets, and multiple properties overseas. Need I continue?" Silence. Then, she delivered the final blow. "Mr. Remington, you have abused the system long enough. I am denying bail. You will remain in custody until trial." A stunned gasp rippled through the room. Elliot Remington, billionaire, power broker, king of the financial world, was being treated like any other criminal. Security officers approached him, his face contorted with rage. "You can't do this," he bellowed. "Do you know who I am?" Judge Whitmore's expression didn't change. "I know exactly who you are, and that's precisely why you're being held accountable." The officers reached for his wrists. For the first time in his life, Elliot Remington felt cold steel around them. Elliot Remington's expensive Italian loafers scraped against the cold courtroom floor as the officers led him away. His perfectly tailored suit, the kind that once commanded respect in boardrooms, now felt like a prison uniform in the making. He turned his head sharply, scanning the gallery. The same journalists who used to hang on his every word were now snapping photos of his downfall. The same business associates who once called him brilliant now whispered behind their hands, some even smirking. For the first time in his life, Remington felt small. As he reached the door, he twisted toward Judge Whitmore. "You're making a mistake," he growled. "I have lawyers, real power. I will get out of this." The judge simply leaned forward, resting her chin on her hand. "Then I suppose we'll see you at trial, Mr. Remington." The click of the handcuffs tightening around his wrists sent a shiver through him. The holding cell smelled of stale sweat and regret. The cold metal bench dug into his back. He had spent 48 hours in county lockup, an experience he had never thought possible for someone like him. His attorney had promised a bail appeal, but nothing had come through yet. His calls to former allies, CEOs, senators, even judges he had once wined and dined, were ignored or met with vague assurances that they'd see what they could do. They were abandoning him, just like he would have abandoned them. A guard approached, unlocking the cell. "Remington, you've got a visitor." He expected his attorney. Instead, it was David Whitaker, the man he once called his trusted financial advisor, now the key witness against him. Whitaker folded his arms, studying Remington through the glass. "Crazy how fast things change, huh?" Remington scowled. "You betrayed me." Whitaker shook his head. "No, Elliot. You betrayed yourself. You thought you were untouchable. Turns out, the law finally caught up to you. For once, Remington had no response. The guard tapped his baton against the bars. Visitation's over. As Whitaker turned to leave, he paused. Enjoy your time in here, Elliot. Something tells me you're going to be staying a lot longer than you think. And for the first time, Elliot Remington believed it.